Hey everybody, Donny Budinsky here from Standing for Truth. This video is the first rebuttal from our debate with Culture Cats. We had a ton of fun with this debate. It was very informative and consisted of a lot of the most up-to-date information and arguments from both sides. We were thrilled to have the opportunity to have this debate seminar with Culture Cats, as he is an experienced debater. He's also a skilled debater, and we are very happy with how this exchange, this event turned out. Now, of course, to see the full context of what we are responding to in this 25-minute rebuttal, and to be fair to Cats, make sure to check out the debate linked in the description box of this video. Thank you and enjoy. We've concluded our opening statements of tonight's debate seminar. Like I said, comprehensive, 50 minutes each. We have many points on the table to rebut and respond to. And even though we have 25 minutes each, I can tell it's going to be fast-paced for both sides. So, okay, let's move into our rebuttal. Cats, we'll put you backstage. And Matt and I on the screen. 25 minutes. I'll go 12 and a half minutes. We'll split it up. And Matt, this should be good. We got a lot to respond to. So, okay, I'll start right now. Okay, points for rebuttal. I made a ton of notes, and I appreciate just how thorough Cats was in his opening statement, and so we'll take it one at a time. Does good science affirm scripture? Yes, I believe that is an accurate statement. In many ways, the evolutionists could say the same thing. Cats could say, well, good science affirms common descent and an old earth. But the question is, does it? And no, good science affirms biblical origins, as we have seen, and precludes common descent. I think Cats is misunderstanding what we are doing here to demonstrate our affirmative. Okay, we have the data, we have the evidence. We all have the same data, and we are model building. Creationists are model building, evolutionists are model building. We look at the data and we draw conclusions based on it. Okay, I discussed how there's a lot of overlapping evidence where both models can largely account for the data. What we want to focus on is discriminatory data. And I'm glad that Cats provided some evidence that we can deal with that he believes favors his position. Okay, it just turns out that these conclusions line up beautifully with what the Bible says. It did not have to be true that all humans go back to a single mitochondrial DNA ancestor and a single Y chromosome ancestor. If evolution were true, this did not have to be the case. According to the evolutionary model, you have 2 out of Africa events. You have apparently Erectus leaves and independently evolves into other hominins like Heidelbergensis, Neanderthal, Erectus, or Naledi, Floresiensis on the island of Flores, for example. And you'd have people, so historically random mating is not true. Historically, you'd have people existing in tribes and essentially marrying within those tribes. And so should we find a single Y chromosome lineage and a single mitochondrial DNA lineage? I would say no. We should find many mitochondrial DNA lineages and many Y chromosome lineages. And it turns out, amazingly, that genetic data has connected all human beings back to a single female and single male. These genetic links do not find a match in chimpanzee. Both DNA compartments are incredibly different to the chimpanzee. And again, this data could have come about. We could have went into model building to try and draw conclusions supporting our model, and we could have found genetic data that actually falsifies our model. Okay, so moving on. He said we are forcing a supernatural explanation. That's untrue. We are showing why the data actually demands a supernatural origin for man. Patriarchal drive, yes, Dr. Rob Carter published a paper in the Journal of Creation on that. We cited, at least I cited, his paper in the conventional literature on mitochondrial DNA diversity that shows the Eve consensus sequence, and we're concerned with how long it takes to accumulate the differences that we see, and the average difference is between 25 and 30. He demonstrated that there's low diversity, and with a fast mutation rate, that's biblical time. Doesn't take long at all to accumulate those DNA differences. Patriarchal drive, yes. If the Bible's account of origins is true and our biblical patriarchs lived hundreds of years old, then naturally you're going to be hit. The next generation is going to be hit with more mutations because they are going to accumulate more mutations. Patriarchal drive refers to men, those with the Y chromosome. And so Shem, Ham, and Japheth could have hypothetically been genetic poison to the post-flood population, where you have a whole ton of mutations exploding into the population right away on a phylogenetic tree that would look like a lot of time, a longer branch, even though it's just a short amount of time. He also mentioned the out of Africa theory and why he was moving quick, but assuming he believes the out of Africa theory, the data strongly suggests that. No, I showed evidence for variable mutation rates. I've also got a paper here on my slideshow somewhere showing that certain regions of the genome in Africans mutate faster. And so what Katz doesn't realize is that everything is going to nest within the epicenter of where we all originated or dispersed from. And the epicenter of genetic diversity is right around the Middle East and Africa. But where we actually place that epicenter is based on several assumptions, many of them unknowable assumptions. But all we need is a higher mutation rate in certain African lineages, a selective sweep, where let's say you have a selective sweep across Eurasia that results in older lineages being wiped out, with older lineages in Africa remaining or surviving. Africa could have started with higher population sizes, initial population sizes, where people move out of Babel and into Africa, waves and waves of people into Africa. And Noah's descendants could have brought a lot of genetic diversity into Africa to start with. We also know when it comes to recombination, we have this interesting gene, PRDM9 gene, and that works with recombination. African populations have more of those, and so you'd expect to have more genetic diversity. There's many points there refuting the out of Africa assumptions. Next one, order of fossils. Okay. I would say just overall, the pervasive pattern observed in the fossil record is sudden appearance and stasis and extinction. We don't see these large scale changes. Yeah, we could argue about a few interesting transitional forms, but if evolution were true, common descent, we should find millions and millions of transitional forms, not just a few interesting ones like Tiktaalik or Archaeopteryx or the mammal-like reptiles, these interesting mosaics. No, we'd expect to find millions of transitional forms connecting, not these explosions that we find of novel body plans and phyla like in the Cambrian explosion. But I want to see an answer to what I presented in my opening statement, that where's the evidence for the hominin story of evolution? Katz wants to focus on fossils in the ordering of the fossil record. Where's all the Erectus bones? Erectus apparently lives on the planet for 1 million to 2 million years. Let's say their generation time is 25 years. They exist in, let's say, a population of 1 million. Where's the billions and billions of dead bodies? We don't find them. There's no evidence for their grave sites, their campsites, their stone structures. Yeah, we find a couple, which is consistent with an out of Babel model, but we don't find nearly enough that would support the hominin story of evolution. We, as a matter of fact, could fit all the Erectus bones in the trunk of a car. Finding a human bone in a lower layer with a plesiosaur, let's say, would be like finding a needle in a haystack. I wouldn't expect to find it. What does the Bible say? God creates two people, Adam and Eve, and populations of animals in fully working and fully functioning ecosystems. So you'd start off with millions of different species of animals, but 2 humans. 2,000 years comes, you have the flood. The population could have been smaller than most people think, because the Bible does say that there was a lot of violence and wickedness and murder, and that every thought of every man was wicked. Therefore, at the time of the flood, you could have humans in a smaller number in a localized area. That area of the earth could have been subducted with no evidence now, or they were buried and it's like finding a needle in a haystack. But what would we expect to find? Billions of animals. And that's exactly what we find. But this whole argument from the ordering of the fossil record, it's fallacious. Here's an example of what I mean. Coelacanth supposedly went extinct millions and millions of years ago. Okay. And then we find it swimming around in our oceans today, supposedly something that went extinct. And yet we don't find coelacanths buried with humans or whales. Okay, we know they existed at the same time of these ancient creatures. But wait a minute, they did exist this entire time, because we find them living today. And so just because we don't find certain creatures in certain layers does not mean that they didn't exist together, because guess what? Coelacanths existed with ancient creatures that don't exist today, like certain dinosaurs, because we find them buried together. But we don't find them buried with whales, but yet we know that they live together with whales, because we find both whales and coelacanths swimming around today. And so trying to argue that humans evolved later because they're not found with plesiosaurs is simply fallacious. Okay, moving on. Coal, not really my expertise. The debate resolution has to do with Adam and Eve. I am focusing on the genetics of Adam and Eve, but I'll tackle it a bit and then save the rest for Matt. Coal is a fossil fuel formed, apparently, according to the Evolutionist, from the remains of ancient plants and animals that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. These remains accumulated in swampy areas that were gradually buried under layers of sediment. And over millions of years, the millions of years assumption, the immense pressure from the overlying layers and the heat from the earth would work to eventually form coal. Well, cats must forget that in the flood, we would have a great amount of heat, energy, pressure to rapidly form things like coal, oil, natural gas. We'd have plenty of vegetation to rapidly form things like coal. The pre-flood world would have acted as the perfect battery in light of the heat, pressure, and catastrophic effects to create things like coal. And so I don't see that as being a problem. Created heterozygosity says that there's some problems with created heterozygosity. Well, I went over evidence for DNA functions suggesting that design diversity is true. He'll have to address that and explain how his model can account for all of this DNA function in light of the high deleterious mutation rate that is going to drive species into extinction. Okay, we have about 3 million places in our own genome where our copy differs from mother and father. In about 3 million places, they differ. That's why I said in my opening, my wife and I could hypothetically have 1 million kids, and every single kid would be different because we have pre-existing heterozygosity. And so if we carry 3 million, Adam could have easily carried 10 to 20 million. Today, if I remember correctly, we have 10 million common variants spread out around the globe. And so those could have all been in the ark, in Noah's family. They could have been in the population before they spread out. Okay. And Adam, again, could add 10 to 20 million. There's no real contradiction to what we see in terms of allele frequency. Okay. Most of the variation we see in the world is 2 alleles, A or C, G or T. And then after creation, we have thousands of years for mutations to happen to pick up more diversity. He talked about Lenski and beneficial mutations and so-called new information. Well, in every case, in Lenski's experiment, the genes were deleted, broken, downregulated, or eliminated. The majority of so-called beneficial mutations that we observe, they are reductive, functionally compromising to organisms. So it's not necessarily about, well, we want a mutation that adds information. No, we want to see the amount of necessary beneficial mutations that are non-reductive that can counterbalance the damage that's being done due to the massive numbers of low impact, slightly deleterious, nearly neutral mutations that are pouring into the genomes of living organisms today. And so Lenski's experiment does not help. Lenski demonstrated reductive evolution. Apparently, the best way to speed up growth in Lenski's bacteria was to eliminate genes. Necessary genes were removed since those genes slowed down the bacteria, and just more evidence for genetic degeneration. Kinds, we showed plenty of evidence that separates kinds, that separates humans from any other form of life. Y chromosome dissimilarity, I'll have to get to that a little bit later. Dating methods. Matt wrote a book. So I am at 13 and a half minutes. Matt, let's throw it to you, brother. Start right away. You've got right up till 25 minutes. Go ahead.
Alrighty. First thing I think you should know is that there's two different ages for the earth. One is in a book called the Greek Septuagint. It gives an older date for creation and the flood. So that's why when you're looking at something like an Egyptian pyramid that's around 4,500 years old, that's like, why is that at the same date as the flood? How could there be a population to build it? Actually, they had over 1,000 years to do it. So what we actually see is more evidence for around 5,000 years for pretty much everything down the line, from the dispersion of new harmful mutations arising about 5,000 years ago. We have unbroken chains of genealogies going back to Adam and Eve. Here's a 54-foot parchment at the Lambeth Palace of Library. There's also one at the British Museum for the British Royal List that arose in 1711 or 1171. We have astronomy, goes back about 5,000 years. Medicine, 5,000 years. Irrigation, 5,000 years. Like you said, the trees almost go back about 5,000 years. The oldest desert, about 4,000 years. We have some of the oldest islands that are from sand, go back about 5,000 years. We got the longest living organisms that might not really even die. They're about 4,270, about 5,000 years old. So I like Occam's razor for this because it's the best explanation, is the most simplest, that accounts for all of the data. And just look at everything that matches. We have unbroken chains of genealogies, and that matches the genealogical rate, that matches the mutation rate. It goes back about the same time period. Everything just fits so good. Patriarchal drive, it is true, but I would like to say, well, how else would you run a global flood model bottleneck with old people without running the math using that very status? You gotta run a simulation. We don't have old people to put into a bottleneck, even though I'm sure we would want to. They actually used a published study by Kong et al. 2012. It was a secular paper that discovered that the older a person gets, the more mutations they pass on. So all they did is take that and say, okay, let's compare that to Noah if he had 500 mutations and see what would happen if that person had a child. And it created a biological decay curve, exactly what we would expect to find if that was true. It didn't have to be, landed on it pretty good. Another one would be genetic boundaries. I was showing earlier that how would we know what is related to a kind would be a convergence going back in time to a consensus sequence. How do we know that a bonobo and a chimpanzee are related? You go backwards in time to find out if they converge on the similar sequence going back in time. And that is what we see. We can do the same thing with cats. Here is the feline, all of them put together. The pink is the lowest mutation rate found in the species, with the maximum at the very top. We find around 100 or so mutations. That's the maximum in the species. So all cats are within just that window, about 115 and lower. Now, how do we determine that? Because there's some variety, right? There's a nucleotide 58 between lions and tigers, for example, or 58. And then we have 45 between cheetah. So how would we know what's really going on? I'm sorry, panther. If they're related, it really doesn't have to do with how many differences there are. The differences might relate to time, like there's 82 base pair differences between a cat and a lion. But what really matters is there a convergence going back in time to a similar sequence? Because if there is, it had to be on this side of the bottleneck. Because remember, genetic diversity is reset at a bottleneck in the mitochondria. So if everything is converging back to a single line, that's how we know all dogs are related to a single wolf pair. And that's how we can look at cats and say, oh, they fall within the same kind. One thing that did surprise me, though, actually, here's just a picture of a cat. You really can't even tell in the fossil record the difference besides size with cats. They're almost very similar, almost identical. Well, when looking at bears, I was like, okay, well, bears might be all related. It seems like something. I actually found out, no, there are actually 3 different kinds of bears. There's a vegetarian, carnivore, and an omnivore type. So they would actually be separated into 3 separate kinds. So we're getting to the ability now where we can genetically determine what a kind is. And it's great because we've never had an answer for that before. So it's a great thing to do, but it's very time consuming. I literally hate it. I wish I would get some help on it. As far as a fossil record, I actually think that it shows great evidence of a flood, because when you look at the Triassic habitat, you see that that was buried first, and then we find a Cretaceous habitat, and then you notice it's being pushed by water towards the perimeter of the continent. And then at the very end, you see it right here. It's being like right at the very, very edge. And then what do we see? Massive depths of sand buried right at the end, like it dumped right in from the continent right into the ocean. And people love the fossil record, but I don't know why. It literally had a single prediction: Darwinian evolution, slow. What did we find? Literally everything else except for that. We found everything: ghost lineages, convergent evolution, stasis, Lazarus taxons, de-evolution, where it goes backwards in time. I think the fossil record is kind of funny. It's interesting to find instead of finding the slow, smooth, progressive change Laurel and Darwin had expected, they found the fossil record rapidly changed, new species appearing out of nowhere, ghost lineages. And what do we see in the fossil record? We always see tracks before we find the animals in layers that can some be millions of years old. That sounds like a flood, doesn't it? Moving up. The only thing that doesn't make sense would be the dates. But first, how do we know that the geographical location can refute this evolutionary paradigm? Easy. We can look at flightless birds. These are ratites. And we know that they've pretty much always been flightless from the fossil record that we find them in. So what would we look at? We would look at their phylogeny that was built off mutations and then where they are living. And to their surprise, the elephant bird are most closely related to kiwis. Completely unexpected and unprecedented. They did not expect this. Matter of fact, the entire phylogenetic chart built off of them doesn't match their landlocked ancestor. Like, for example, you would expect the species that's in Africa, the ostrich, to be more related to what's in Madagascar. But in reality, look at what it actually builds. Completely backwards of what you would expect it to be. Like, everything is completely wrong. So genetics completely refutes that. It's just one of the easiest ways to do it. That doesn't take very long to do. He liked radiometric dating. So let's hop over here real quick. And we are going to go with what is the most important part. He mentioned homogeneity. It's basically is the rock homogeneous inside, because that's what it takes for isochron dating. Well, guess what? There's a study that came out on that very thing, testing 29,000 different isotopes inside there. Now, to run over, this is the margin of error, and right inside of it is lead, and that's 2 different lead dating methods right there. Now, what do we want to find? We want to find concordance. We want to find overlap, and we want them to overlay with one another. That's what you're looking for. What you don't want to see is something outside the dating methods not lining up concordant. So what did the study find? Well, these 2 methods are at the top, are concordant. These 2 methods are concordant. Everything, but as you could tell, everything tested was almost different from one another. Very interesting, right? Look at this. This is a single rock that was tested with testing different isotopes inside. You can see the score is 0.07. That's not good. The best you can get is 1. And as you can see, there's very little overlap. You can see rubidium and strontium with potassium and argon lined up, but everything else really just didn't do very good. Here's another one, a better score. Here you find uranium and thorium. Oh, look at that. Uranium to lead, 2 separate things, completely off, even though it was tested with the exact same thing. So these are all isochron dates. And even when they are concordant, like this one would be considered a 9.2 score, almost a 1. So it's really good. So even though it scored that high, they were still off by 400 million years. Pretty interesting, right? Here, this one's off by 820 million years. They got a score of 0 using isochron dating. So what did they do? They said, let's compare 3 different types of dating methods to one another and run what it should look like. The score was all over the place. It was so bad that the best it could get out of all methods was 53%. That's a coin toss. That's how bad isochron dating was. And they only tested 3 with one another. Imagine if they tested all of the methods with one another. So this pattern, they also found something very interesting as well. Heavier isotopes tended to yield older ages. Now we're getting somewhere. The systematic discordance is what it was actually called. They found that lead, in this order, lead was lower than rubidium to strontium, which was lower than uranium to lead, or 235, which was lower than 238, which was lower than 232. thorium, which is lower than potassium. Oh, interesting. So is that why they're dating the fossil record on this? Because of atomic weight and not actually because of age? Ooh, I dare say. So some of the results were older than the Earth itself. Others gave negative ages. The majority of rock dating methods all date different from one another. These were called systematic discordances.
2 minutes left.
Okay, there should not be any order to these dates given from different radioactive age isotopes, but there are. So this brings us probably to the most awesome thing. Let me see if I could find it. It's this. Here we go. Okay. Potassium argon dating. What they did is they went to the mid-Atlantic ridge and they went down and they followed lava flow, and they knew that and they tested it, and it was 22 million years old, but the lava was considered to be fairly recent. So they went in the study and they said, look at this. This lava is very young, probably less than 200 years old. So what did they do? They went out another 200 years and they kept going, and guess what they found? The seafloor dated 22 million years old here, 190 million years here, and then right at the very edge, about 380 million, yet it was only 3,408 years old. And then about 4,500 years old on the oldest at the very top of the largest mountains on Earth, the Himalayas, which dated 500 million years old. Isn't that perfectly in line with the biblical creationist timeline? And it didn't have to be that way. And that's in the published peer-reviewed literature. And since they take radiometric dating and they use it for everything, it's the basis that flows out to calculate with everything else. If it's wrong, that makes everything else that flows from it very wrong. Now, I'm not saying that all of them are wrong. We can look at carbon dating, and it's good. It's good for a certain while. But guess what? This is one of the study where they actually tested it against others. 23 laboratories, or a total of 23 were sent out to 38 laboratories, and they completely failed. They noticed that it was 18% pass. That's atrocious. So we want to ask ourselves, is it really, why do they get dates going further back? It's because they believe in constant uniformitarianism. What did we find? If anything, if there's recent volcanic activity that's going to be devoid of C14, it's going to completely change the date. So we want to ask ourselves, if there was a flood, what would that do? Would it give older dates? Absolutely, it would. So that's the whole question. If uniformitarianism is true, sure, those dates make perfect sense. But if there was a flood that had universal catastrophic things like a volcanism, what would it do? Would it change the dates to make them look older than anything else is? Absolutely. And that's the whole question. Our goal is to be able to answer these things. And we can do that.